that there are those who wish to claim that making abortion illegal represents the will of people of faith in our country. Yet those of us here today agree that making abortion illegal is actually a violation of our religious liberty. By sharing our viewpoints and perspectives with each other, we empower ourselves to advocate not just for our own faith traditions, but also for others' faith traditions. And so our program today will hopefully provide us with some comfort, community, and power, all of which are greatly needed at this moment. So many of us here today may be familiar with what Judaism says about abortion rights, but I'm just going to summarize that position before we continue. So Jewish values teach, and let me emphasize that this is not just liberal Jewish values, but even the Jewish values that are taught by our traditionally observant movements. Jewish values teach that full access to safe and legal abortion care is basic health care. According to Jewish law, the fetus is like water before 40 days of gestation. And after that, the fetus is a potential life, not a full life, and therefore does not have the same rights as the pregnant person. The fetus is viewed as a part of the pregnant individual's body without its own life or rights up until the moment that it becomes separate from the parent's body, with the largest part of the body, traditionally the head, when that part emerges from during the birthing process. And so because of this, Judaism believes that abortion is not only permitted, but is required if the pregnancy threatens the life or health of the pregnant person. Many rabbis also believe that when we talk about the health of the pregnant person, that also includes the psychological health of the person who's pregnant, not just their physical health. So how does this impact our understanding of the rights of the fetus? One of the most important commandments in Jewish tradition is called pikuach nefesh. It means saving a life. And in Jewish law, the fetus, it's not yet considered a person, and therefore, since it doesn't have the same rights as the person who's pregnant, and I can't say this enough, since the fetus is still just a potential life, the individual who's pregnant, however, is the full life. And this life is what must be saved at all costs throughout their pregnancy. As a result, the rights of the pregnant individual, the full life, always come before those of the fetus, which is the potential life. So this brings us back to the concept that in Jewish law, abortion is not only permitted, but sometimes even required. And then we come full circle back to the statement that Jewish tradition teaches that full access to safe and legal abortion care is basic health care. So, having now refreshed our memory about the Jewish view of abortion, it's time to hear about the perspectives of various Christian denominations. I'm going to ask each speaker to briefly introduce themselves and in about 5 minutes each to help us understand the key points of their denomination's views and theology on abortion rights and abortion access. And I know 5 minutes sounds almost impossible, but I know they're going to be able to do it. So why don't we're just going to go in alphabetical order. So let's start with Reverend Anzilotti. Thank you for being here.
I figured that was going to happen. Hi, my name is Laurie Ancelotti. I am a priest in the Episcopal Diocese of Missouri. So, and I serve at St. Francis Episcopal Church in Eureka, right out by Six Flags. I can see the Ferris wheel from my window. So, and it's not as far as you think it is. I live down by Forest Park, so 30 minutes, easy. I think there's an importance to understanding what it means to be Episcopalian that helps to understand our church's position on abortion. We are part of the Anglican Communion, so the Church of England, which because of colonialism has branches all over the world. The Episcopal Church, we were in a little bit of a conundrum when we had that Revolutionary War. How do you keep your religion but not be part of the Church of England? We became the Episcopal Church. So understanding the history of the Anglican Church is actually really important to understanding how we approach our perspective to abortion. So here's the story. You had Roman Catholicism everywhere in the globe, and there was a split. People were looking to reform Roman Catholicism. And there was a tension at the very founding of this start of the Church of England between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. And that tension continues to this day. That's why I wear a collar that looks like a Catholic priest collar. So we are called the via media, the middle way. We have elements of Roman Catholicism, we have elements of Protestantism. So many of the ways that we approach things are a middle way. And if I had more than 5 minutes, I could give other examples. But the way we look at abortion is very much this middle way. So you're not going to hear from the Episcopal Church that we have a traditional left or right perspective. What you hear from our church is this, that we affirm. I'm going to ask you to set aside all those words. I'm going to ask you to set aside sort of what it means to some of that traditional left or right language, because what we affirm is the sacredness of all life from its beginning until its end. But we also unequivocally oppose any legislation, executive or judicial action on the part of local, state, or national governments that abridge the right of a woman to reach an informed decision, or that would limit her access to a means of acting on that decision. So you can hear right there, we affirm the sacredness of life. That would make people say, oh, you belong in this camp. But we also believe that there should not be any legislation prohibiting full access to women's reproductive health. Oh, that means you're in this camp. So you can see again how we are that via media. We also have some distinctions. We emphatically oppose abortion as a means of birth control, family planning, sex selection, for any kind of I want to make sure I've got the right wording here, for abnormalities that are life-threatening, like if you're having a child who has some kind of physical abnormality, we don't support abortion in that case unless the child's life is threatened or the mother's life is threatened. And we regard all abortion as having some tragic dimension that calls for concern and for compassion. So there it is in 5 minutes, the Episcopal Church as that via media, but emphatically clear since the earliest, I went all the way back to our 1967 convention, emphatically clear since pre-Roe v. Wade that women's health care includes full access to reproductive rights, and that the sacredness of life, there's my timer for 5 minutes, that the sacredness of life means having full moral choice, moral decision for ourselves.
Oh, thank you. That was so wonderful and so clear. Thank you very much. And so next, I'd like to invite Reverend Kennedy to speak with us.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Rabbi Schloss. I really appreciate it. My name is Reverend Gabrielle Kennedy. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am delighted to be here to have this discussion, but disturbed that we have to have this discussion. So I am an itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church in the Missouri Conference here in St. Louis, which runs from Columbia to St. Louis and then from St. Louis down to Cape Girardeau. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church, is, we call it a connectional church, much like the United Methodist Church, but it is a separate denomination. It is a denomination that is grounded in its history and whose response is also connected to that history. So the response to the reversal of Roe v. Wade with Dobbs v. Jackson is grounded in that. We can't get away from the fact that that we understand, and I will say that these statements that were made came from both the Council of Bishops, which is the top of our hierarchy, if you will, and then also the AME Health Commission. So there were two statements that were given by those organizations within the Connectional Church, and one of them starts out by saying the Council of Bishops of the African Methodist Episcopal Church condemns the United States Supreme Court decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, and that it puts millions of women's lives in danger and threatens the civil rights of all people. Coming from a history where social justice is what birthed us, not because our decision, the decision of Richard Allen, Reverend Richard Allen, and his comrades to leave St. George's Church in 1787 to go worship in the blacksmith's shop was not because the beliefs were different. So it wasn't because of the doctrine, but it was because of social conditions, not being able to kneel at the rail to pray freely. And so this is we cannot separate our social, we cannot separate our economic, we cannot separate all of those other conditions from this particular condition. And one of the biggest reasons is because the health of Black women and the health of Black, brown, and poor women is the health that will suffer the most here. With states having the right to make the decisions about whether or not abortion will be legal in that state, the ability to travel, the affordability to travel means that Black and brown women who are disproportionately poor will get the short end of the stick here. I do not believe in the statements. You can go to the websites. You will see that the statements say that we do not believe that this is about pro-life at all. This is about pro-birth. Because if it were about pro-life, then it would be from the womb to the tomb. And there would be some concern about children after they're born, whether or not they have medical care. This would be about whether or not there were guns on the street. This would be about state-sanctioned executions. And so because the same folks who are saying that, who say they're pro-life, also are advocating for assault weapons, freedom to do that. These same folks are wanting to cut back and not provide medical care. There's a disconnect there. And so and in Black church, I'm gonna stop there. I'm a Black preacher. I can keep going. I really can. But I'm gonna stop right there. And I'm gonna allow you to ask me questions before I go ahead. But thank you.
Thank you so much. That was your passion is, and the passion. It's fascinating to hear that how in both cases the origin of the church matters so much in the policy and the way the movement and the denomination then looks at current reality today.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating. So thank you. And next, I'd like to invite Reverend Turner to speak with us as well.
Thank you. And I wanted to say, no, keep going, keep going. So I'm a pastor in the United Church of Christ and also have standing in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. Those are two different progressive denominations. The UCC is one of the most progressive denominations in the whole country. And we are we observe a congregationalist polity, which means we do not have a dogma by which all churches or all members of the religious bodies adhere to or subscribe to. And so there is within our churches every imaginable opinion, often depending on the particular congregation, but across many congregations within the denomination, every possible viewpoint on abortion. But that does not mean that the denomination does not have an opinion. We do meet every other year for a national meeting of, church leadership and members, and at those, resolutions are passed that simply state the majority will of the people who are present. And we have consistently since the 1960s been in favor of a woman's right to determine her own reproductive fate. That stance has never changed, and it's still strong in that. Even though we don't have a dogma, well, obviously we do have theology, and one strong theology that recurs a lot in UCC thinking is the idea of that humanity is are co-creators with God, that God is creator, and those of us who are in God's image are responsible for co-creation, and that we are creative beings. But the way that we look at that is that there's also personal agency with that ability to create, and that agency can determine, when we want to create and when it's not time to create. And so a woman is always given the full responsibility, ultimately, for making her own reproductive decisions. And the denomination doesn't go into particular circumstances of pregnancy or different kinds of abortion or the trimester system or anything like that in determining when a woman has agency. The denomination simply does not say, well, abortion is bad in some cases and okay in others, because the ultimate authority of that always is the woman. As a Christian, and many of you do already know that I was the executive director of Missouri Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, which became Faith Aloud, which was easier to say, but not necessarily descriptive of what we did. But in that work for 15 years, what I learned in doing that work and doing a lot of presentations like this, going to a lot of colleges, speaking with literally thousands and thousands of people and thousands of women who were making difficult choices or had already had abortions and were struggling with that, even with the aftermath of their choice. What I learned for Christian women was the importance of talking about Jesus. And to tell stories about Jesus and women always, every single story is always going to be one of respect, one of Jesus giving agency to that woman, and never telling her, well, you have to do this, or shaming her in any way. And he always stepped in when men's voices were shaming, or when societal voices were shaming. Jesus' attitude was always removing that shame and just simply not allowing for that as an appropriate way to interact with people who were in difficult situations. And so the bottom line, I feel for my own faith, and since I am Christian, following the example of Jesus, is to say, is to treat women with complete respect. And that again is giving them full agency for exactly how their life is going to turn out. We absolutely also talk about also being in a lot of places where I was asked a lot of questions when conservative Christians would throw Hebrew scriptures at me as their way to defend their anti-abortion stance, I would quickly say, well, you know, those are Hebrew texts. And the way that Jewish rabbis interpret those texts is this. And thank you to all of you who are Jewish rabbis who taught me those things. And so, you know, and no matter how they would try to argue with me, but Psalm this or Genesis this, I'd be like, yeah, but that's Hebrew, and we have stolen those scriptures, and so we need to look for Jewish interpretation of those scriptures, and you're misusing them. So so that's kind of also the way I have borrowed a great deal from the knowledge of the rabbis in sharing the understanding of nefesh, the understanding of when life begins, and the agency of the woman.
That was amazingly powerful description. And I love the way that you talk about how your community really responds to using Jesus and hearing about how Jesus would be, you know, how does Jesus provide a model for, you know, for you in this story? That's really very powerful. Thank you. Thank you to all three of you. We're going to turn for a moment now. We have a couple of questions that we've asked our members of our panel to prepare. And then after that, just so you know how we're going to proceed, we'll have some open time for open question and answering from the people who are present today. So the first question that we were thinking about in advance was, so to explain, so from my perspective, when I think that liberal Jews often assume that it's only liberal Jews who are supportive of abortion rights. And the surprise for them is learning that even a traditional understanding of Judaism also supports abortion rights. So I am wondering for each of you, what is the most common misunderstanding about your community's views on abortion rights, even potentially from within your own community? And how do you respond to that? So I don't know if one of you wants to raise your hand and jump in first, or.
Well, I'm unmuted.
Go for it.
Okay, so I would say that Black church does have this tendency around being conservative, and I will note that especially where women are concerned. Okay, so general Black church, right? So more Pentecostal, Kojic, Church of God in Christ, Baptist, where there's more of this kind of traditional conservative idea about where women belong in the church. Although there's movement there. And some of that is it's a Black church thing. So AME being in that group, that does happen in the AME church. However, one of the things that did not happen here is that the AME church did not make the mistake of viewing abortion as I said before, as a pro-life issue. It did not make the mistake of doing that, but as a part of a wider conversation about freedom, about liberty, about control over one's body. And because that is connected so deeply with our history, it has been identified as, okay, when you are not able to make decisions about your own body, then there's going to be some trouble, okay? Let's talk about how the enslaved had no choice but to be heterosexual. Let's talk about how the enslaved had to be mated with people they may not have wanted to be mated with and forced to have children whenever the slave master thought that it fit for them. So anytime we get to a place where someone is asking, it is demanding that you make a certain decision about your own body. So this it automatically started to take on this wider conversation about what it means to not have control over your body. I think that's probably, and then in addition to that, the connection to our contemporary reality, right? That talks about what the ability to have full access to abortion as healthcare means to a demographic of folks who are Black women 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth. To be forced into childbirth, and you're 3 to 4 more times more likely to die in childbirth. Okay, yeah. So these are the kinds of dots I think that both in and out of our denomination need to be, and out of our faith need to be connected, and especially for the demographic of Black and brown women as they consider their choices for abortion care and healthcare.
Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead.
I could springboard just because I think there's that same misconception, Gabrielle, that we're conservative, right? So everybody knows, like, the National Cathedral is an Episcopal cathedral. We were the state religion when hundreds of years ago when we broke off. More presidents have been Episcopalian than any other denomination, for good or for bad. I'm not claiming that as a pro. But so that this idea that we're white, tight, and traditional. And I love that the misconception there is forgetting how we hold both things together, that we can say and name life is sacred. And by that, our presiding bishop wrote compellingly after the Dobbs case, Michael Curry, most famous for preaching at the wedding of Harry and Meghan, that the court's decision will be particularly acute for those who are impoverished or lack consistent access to healthcare, to the poor and to the vulnerable, and whatever vulnerable means in terms of abuse or domination. So there's this assumption that we're Christian, we're traditional, which we're not, because the Episcopal Church is heading more toward our UCC siblings in terms of being a progressive denomination. So I think that is the misconception, that we must be pro-Roe or anti-Dobbs, or anti-Roe, pro-Dobbs, and we're not, and that we can hold people. It is not our American society to hold two things that seem opposite together. And that's what we do. Life's sacredness and the legalization of all women's healthcare options.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Reverend Turner.
In our congregation, we are such an amalgam of people who have come from many different Christian denominations, and not even all Christian. And we especially over the past several years have had an influx of former Catholic members. And so I would say the greatest misunderstanding among my own congregants is that they think that whatever their previous church believed, that's what everybody believes. And, I think that's especially true of those who have been Catholic, that they assume that Catholic opinion is universal. And it's funny that they choose to join a Protestant church because they didn't like a lot of Catholic opinions, and yet they still come with this preconceived notion about abortion, and then they're surprised. But I also want to say that what plays into any misconceptions that may happen within my church, or I think other white Protestant churches, is that white Protestant pastors have been terrible at teaching what their own church believes about abortion. They really have. They just have avoided the subject, avoided the controversy, and they have not been teaching in their congregations over the past few decades because they have too many people in the churches that are saying, don't get political on us, don't get controversial. And so they teach nothing. And that means that the biggest misunderstanding is that people are taking their theology from the media rather than from their pastors.
Can I share a quick story? When I was in seminary, so I was a Roman Catholic, and about 10 years later was in seminary at Eden, UCC seminary, had some Episcopal Anglican classes toward my ordination. And I was 2 years into seminary and several like one-on-one intensive study classes in, and said to my professor, Dan Handschief, wait a minute, you're never going to ask me what I think about abortion, are you? And he's like, nope, never. And I felt like I've been hiding, like in my denomination. This just speaks so much to what you said, hiding, like, okay, I'm an Episcopal, but nobody's talking about it. You know, I've been very active, very involved. Two semesters into this intensive course, and he's like, we never will, because we're going to tell you to do the same thing with that we say with everything. Go to scripture, go to tradition, go to your own reason. You decide. So there's a personal story that encapsulates, I think, exactly what you were just pointing to within the UCC.
Wow, that's amazing. So I'd like to turn us to another question. As you think about these issues of abortion access, what is it that you're most worried about, and what right now is keeping you up at night? Under the assumption that I'm probably not the only one who is being kept up at night about these issues. I don't, maybe I am, but are there things that you're really worried about? Maybe both for yourself as a clergy person in this role, or I don't know, or you define it how you will. Reverend Turner, you look like, yeah, go ahead.
My immediate concern is that women will die. My larger kind of global concern is that this is the tip of the iceberg of the loss of rights for people with uteruses, and therefore for all other people whose rights are always in question, or always hanging in the balance. I have real concerns for a reduction. You know, here in Missouri, we know that by the end of the year, there will be lots of bills filed with the Missouri legislature that they'll start hearing, in January, that will not only continue to make abortion in all circumstances illegal, but may infringe upon the right to contraception, may infringe upon the right of Missouri women to travel to Illinois, may even test cases on people's on same-sex marriage. It may, they may start putting those kind of things into the courts in order to get them to SCOTUS for also overturning additional laws. I think, the fascism that is on the rise and is so present in Missouri is a big concern for every single person here, because we are all frightened of losing hard-won rights and of going back to the 1700s, which this SCOTUS seems to want to do.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add to that?
I think for me, what keeps me up is that the bottom of the valley is not the bottom of the valley. That there's actually another level that we can descend into as a society on how we treat one another. And that leads to, I think that leads to despair. And when people are in despair, when people are desperate, they do desperate things. And that bothers me.
Yeah.
I think Reverend Turner summed it up very well. And going back to what Reverend Kennedy said at the very beginning, that the social justice element to it for the most vulnerable people who tend to be brown and Black in our society. Interestingly, just to, again, tie some things together, I read in the New York Times a piece about, Reverend Turner, you said about women crossing state lines, and that case for the Ohio girl who was 10 and went to Indiana. For those of you who might not know, she's 10, she was raped, she went to Indiana to receive an abortion, and they're now working to prosecute her, the doctor who helped facilitate that. And they're actually looking back to laws around fugitive slave laws as legal precedent so that's the most relevant case law in terms of talking about bodies crossing state lines. I mean, I have goosebumps saying it now. It blew my mind. So just to pull together your opening piece with what Reverend Turner just said.
Yeah, well, and I was just at a seminar where we were told, where the rabbis were told, be careful what you look up on your computer. In fact, don't put anything into your search history. Don't use your phones. I mean, it was the list of things that we couldn't do as we try to help our congregants was terrifying. And the person said, I know you all want to be involved in trying to overturn this and then trying to do what you can to help people through this period. But some of you could go to jail for 99 years if you for this. So you have to be very careful of the legal repercussions for you personally, as well as for the congregation in which you serve, as well as for the people that you're helping. And it was just the most, she says, it's not like you're going to go to jail overnight and get a $50 fine. It's not that kind of civil disobedience anymore. So that was also just a very eye-opening from I'm already completely, it's not just the worries about women in the world, it's also the how do I fit in into trying to fix this, the worries about how that happens also are from a clergy person's perspective, were terrifying.
Well, I saw Reverend Cindy Bum's comment in the chat, worrying about ectopic pregnancies and other miscarriages. That is a really large concern of mine. I talked with two friends who are both doctors at WashU, OBGYNs at WashU, have served at the Planned Parenthood clinic. And what's fascinating is one of them has worked in both Catholic hospital systems and non-Catholic hospital systems. And he was explaining to me that when you are not trained in abortion procedures, what happens is you're not trained in in a procedure that needs to be used in other contexts. Because I went and said, listen, we hold these two things together, the sacredness of life and rights. And I struggle sometimes with holding them together. Can you talk to me about it? And they were compelling at talking to me, of giving me real life cases of how not having the training in abortion procedures compromises women's healthcare in other, like other cases that Reverend Bum just brought up, and how then what happens is they're referred out of those systems that didn't have the training to places like WashU, and they're left with the critical cases. And if that kind of training is so greatly reduced across the country, it's not just having an abortion clinic, it's the training within the hospitals for that impacts women's health.
Right. So with all of this going on, what can we be doing to work together? If we come back to that idea of building bridges and our being here together to form larger concentric circles of community, So now I've used two metaphors, the bridges and the circle, so I apologize. So how can we support each other within Christian denominations from an interfaith perspective? Do you have any thoughts about what we can be doing in that area as we join together today?
So the call to action from the AME Church is a few things. The first one is to vote. To vote, 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 and vote some more. That's absolutely the number one thing that we have to do. But the second one is to stop being scared of this topic, because although we have these statements from the connectional level of the church, obviously people within the church have their own ideas, and there are folks who we have the same issue, would not want to be political and all of that. But it's worth the discomfort. It's worth the discomfort to have the conversation, so that we can get this information out there. So we should preach it from the pulpit. We should talk about it in Bible study. We should have the one-on-one conversation, so that we can begin to gain more information about it, specific to this, but more generally about women's health, and understand the statistics around it, especially as it affects Black women's health.
Nice, thank you. Any other thoughts about how we can be supporting together?
The national church, our national church just recommends working with, working collaboratively with other partners, just what's happening here today. If we have what's called the Office for Government Affairs, Office of Government Relations, and they encourage us, as our bishop and presiding bishop of the country, to find events around the country, connect with people, and have encouraged participation in Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. So that's what, our denomination is in support of, that kind of thing. But Reverend Turner, I bet you've got some really good specifics.
I am not taking I'm trying not anyway to take a real major, leadership role here. But what I am seeing, and Stacy Newman has been really great at this, at providing a lot of administrative leadership. But, I see a lot of different clergy and congregations who are wanting to do different kinds of activism. And that's wonderful, because we need all of the kinds of activism that are happening, all of them. And so I see it less as concentric circles and more as a Venn diagram with a whole lot of overlapping in all kinds of different ways. And I think the overlapping is good as long as we're not reinventing the wheel. If we get a good idea, we should first check to see who else is already doing that someone else may have had that great idea. There are ideas about assisting women directly, getting women, Missouri women to Illinois, and even Texas women, traveling through Missouri to get them to Illinois. There's financial assistance, that's out there. It's really, really important. Yes, vote, but we got to get to Jeff City. We got to fight the legislation that's going to have this coming year. Clergy have to be there en masse. People of faith en masse have to be there constantly throughout the next legislative session. Please don't say no to that when somebody invites you to do that. Be on the list that invites you to do that. Be on the Planned Parenthood list and the Pro-Choice Missouri list and the Access Missouri list and Stacy Newman's Progress Missouri list, and be on all of the list so that you know when that stuff is happening and make room for it in your schedules. And those of us who are clergy have got to be about the business of teaching in our own congregations. We have got to, and those of you even who are not clergy, but have some way of facilitating educational offerings within the congregation, so that people are talking, that they are asking questions, that sermons are there, that people hear, that people of faith regularly hear what their faith group does believe and what their faith group is doing. This is time for all of us to be doing all of the things that are essential. Obviously, write and call your elected officials, even when you know what they already think, even if, and Cori Bush is my rep. Yay, I know what she thinks, but I'm going to tell her thank you every time she does something that I love, which is about every day of the week. And I'm also going to write or go to visit or, call those offices where they never vote the way I want to, because we cannot let them get away with thinking that everybody is on their side. And so, write letters to the editors, post on social media, do all of the things that are within your kind of wheelhouse, to let people know that people of faith, that our religious freedoms are absolutely under attack. We know our religious freedom is under attack right now, and we need to be saying that really boldly.
Thank you. Thank you. So what great big ideas, and what really wonderful bullet points of practical is really fantastic. Thank you. I would like to turn us now to our the folks who are participating just by being present today. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to our panel, feel free to put them into the chat. And the folks, there are a couple questions that have also come up already. And I'm going to turn things over now to the hosts who are going to use the chat to ask questions of our panel. I think.
Yeah, I'm working on the technology here.
There we go.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cheryl Adelstein with the Jewish Community Relations Council. We are thrilled to be working with NCJW today and to put on this forum. And I'm looking in the chat for some questions, or if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question. I know we have a lot of amazing activists on the call, and I see a lot of good comments in the chat, but I don't see any actual questions. So does anyone have a question they would like to raise? Julia, I see your hand raised. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask the question.
Okay, great. Thank you. This is directed at Reverend Kennedy. I've heard from white people in the Christian community that people of color look at abortion as genocide. And I was curious if that is a voice that's within the Black community, or if that's people projecting something that they feel. I just don't know what to make of that comment, and I was wondering if you can.
Well, I think that's a monolith that cannot be applied across groups. Certainly not people of color, and certainly not Black people. I think that is. I certainly do understand the. I understand the specific area, right, of and the thought pattern of where that comes from. When you think about especially Black nationalists, when you think about the desire to make sure that we are not reduced in the population, and so I understand where some of that comes from, but it is by far in no means something that we can use to paint a broad brush across for people of color or for Black people.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question they would like to raise with our panelists? And if you're raising your hand, I may not be able to see you. So,
there is a new one in the chat. Yes.
All right. Hillary Hines has raised the question: how do you personally stay hopeful?
I pray every day. I realize that God is bigger than us. I read scripture from Genesis through Revelations, that tells us, like right now I've been doing scripture study of the prophets, Hosea and Amos, and we looked at Elijah and Elisha and First Kings, and how there's this human propensity to evil. We can't get out of our own way, and God is present and responding and working through all of it. Yeah. And I look at beautiful things outside and listen to music that makes me feel bigger than myself.
Thank you.
Reverend Kennedy, did you want to
Go ahead.
answer that? Well, my take is different, and I shared this with a group that some of you were in a couple of weeks ago, and that I don't deal in hope. I am a lover of the writings of Miguel de la Torre, whose very best book is Embracing Hopelessness, and hope is not something I depend on. Instead, I believe that we keep doing the next right thing until hope comes. So sometimes we feel hope and sometimes we don't, and sometimes we don't have any evidence for there to be hope. And but what we can always do is whatever we can do is the next right thing, and we keep going. And yeah, so I highly recommend that book that changes, that, because in his framework, hopelessness and despair are very, very different things. We despair when we don't know a thing to do, or we give in to despair and hopelessness when we stop taking action. Action is the way I fend off any sense of despair.
I would say a big part of staying hopeful is to look back at my ancestors and to see what they had to overcome, to understand that even in the midst of this foolishness we got going on, how much privilege I sit in, and whose shoulders I stand on, and how they were able to get there without half of what I have today, about half of what we have. And that gives me hope. That gives me hope. And staying and studying gives me hope. And being in a community and in a fellowship of folks who touch and agree on that, right? That there's a connection, staying connected with all of these things together, like understanding all of this together is what brings hope for me.
Thank you all. I'm going to bring one more question in from the chat, and then we'll go ahead and close things up today. So we know that in some states there are efforts to try to do some test cases from the religious perspective. And Cindy asked, what about more promotion of the religious freedom aspect? I've seen that there's some movements to go before SCOTUS with a test case from the religious freedom aspects. I guess I would ask more specifically, is within your denomination, are you hearing any talk about that? I know there are some Jewish organizations here in Missouri that are thinking about it. Is that conversation happening within any of your movements?
It may be in the UCC, but I'm not directly involved in it and not aware of what's happening.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead, Rev. Go ahead.
Folks, I heard the rabbi from Florida speak on all things can, not all things can, 1A. It was last Thursday morning. So what was that? The 14th of July. It was excellent. In fact, I listened to the whole thing in preparation for this to have a better understanding of the Jewish perspective on abortion and life scripturally. So I highly recommend listening to it.
Great. We'll find that and send the link out to everybody. I'm going to bring back Rabbi Schloss here. There's a question in the chat for her, and let's ask her that. It says, Rabbi Schloss, isn't there something in scripture that says God breathes life into the fetus at birth and therefore is not a human until that time when God breathes breath, put the soul of the person in the body?
Yeah, so I actually was typing while Reverend Anzilotti was saying the same thing, because I heard the same 1A interview, and I actually found his presentation somewhat distressing, to be frank. I worry that if he's going to be the representative of all of Judaism going forward, looking at SCOTUS, he made me a little nervous. But at the same, or I should say, and at the same time, he did actually use that. I don't know if this is where you heard it, but he also talked about that the breath of life going in, and that then determines the moment. But that's not actually the biblical source that's used in the creation of any of the Jewish law on this issue. So it is a lovely additional way to view it. But when you look actually at the textual resources used by the rabbis in this argument, that's not actually where they get it from. But I thought it was a lovely additional thought about the fact that life begins at the moment that the breath of life is breathed into you. When you first, you take that first breath when you're born, in the birthing process. So it's funny that you mentioned it, because I had not ever thought of that until that interview when he talked about it. So enjoy the interview, and then I'm curious to know whether
Yeah, it also just brings in the perspective of Muslim law,
yes,
law and
really
Quran too, which was yeah. So, but thanks for that.
Yeah.
I'm going to send this over to Jen Bernstein with NCJW to bring us home here.
Thank you all so much. This was so eye-opening and enlightening, and we cannot thank you enough. We are going to be making a tribute on your behalf to your organizations to thank you. We really appreciate this so much. And thank you all for joining us today. If you are not already signed up for our 5 Ways to Advocate NCJW Weekly E-Blast, please let me know and we would be happy to put you on. My email is jbernstein@ncjwstl.org, and I would be happy to sign you up to receive that. Also, I wanted you to kind of save the date. We have an amazing event coming up, and I think if Stacy Newman's I don't think she's still on anymore. She's going to be part of it. We are doing a screening of the documentary The Janes, which some of you have probably heard of. It's about a collaborative of college women in Chicago pre-Roe who facilitated abortion care for people. And we are going to show that movie. And Charles Jaco is actually going to be introducing the program. He went to college with a number of them. So we'll have an interesting viewpoint from him on that as well. Other than that, just again, thank you all for coming today. I am going to be sending out, if you would be so kind as to fill out an evaluation that we're going to be sending out. And I will also send out a link to that NPR interview with the rabbi. So again, thank you all for coming, and take care.